And if you've spent any amount of time in church, you've heard that word disciple probably again and again throughout your life and your church experience. I think we sometimes use it so much that we forget the real meaning of it, though. To be a disciple in its most basic sense means to be a learner or an apprentice. Someone who follows a teacher in order to become like that teacher. A disciple isn't just someone that gathers information, but is shaped by relationship and imitation and obedience. In our culture, we often think of learning as just something that happens in a classroom. You sit and you listen to a lecture, maybe you take notes, you pass a test, and then you move on. But in the first century, learning was much more relational and much more personal. A disciple would spend significant time with their teacher, not only learning what the teacher said, but also learning to live how the teacher lived. Discipleship meant adopting a teacher's priorities and values and way of life. Christian discipleship today isn't simply about believing certain truths. It's about following a person. It's about following Jesus. It means learning from Jesus, trusting in Jesus, and ordering our lives around Jesus, all so that we can become more like Jesus. It involves leaving behind some things that maybe we once held on to, and it also means being led into something far better. It is, in every sense, an invitation to give all of ourselves to the one who gave everything for us. So over the next 4 weeks, we're going to explore what it really means to be discipled, what Jesus calls us to, why it matters, and how following Him shapes every part of our life. And if we're honest, that call to discipleship can sound a little intimidating at first, because Jesus doesn't present us with an easy path. He makes it very clear that following Him will cost us something. But what we gain is far better than what we leave behind. As someone once said, the demands of following Christ will cost you everything, but you gain far more than you give up. You give up dirt in exchange for diamonds. I like the image that creates. You give up dirt for diamonds. It's a powerful picture. When we come to Christ, we're not losing what is truly valuable. We're trading what can't really satisfy for something that is infinitely better. And during Jesus' ministry, He had massive crowds following Him wherever He went. They were drawn to His authority and His preaching. They were drawn to His compassion. They were drawn to His miracles. They saw these amazing things, and they wanted to get close to Jesus. They wanted to be around Him. They wanted to hear what He had to say. But Jesus was never primarily concerned about building a platform like some social media influencer, right? He didn't care about all the clicks and all the follows and all the likes. What He was concerned with was transforming people's lives. He wanted to create disciples. And so we find this one particular instance where a massive crowd had gathered around Jesus. It's recorded in Luke chapter 9. Actually, it's recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. But in Luke chapter 9 in particular, it tells the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? But that count is a little off because that's just the men. That doesn't even account for all the women and children who may have been there. So there could have been, 10, 15, even 20,000 people gathered on that hillside that day as Jesus fed them. But as I said, He wasn't as concerned about building a following as He was about transforming those people into true disciples. And so here in Luke 9, after this amazing miracle, He makes one of the clearest statements about what it means to be a disciple. He says in Luke 9, verse 23, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." In this one sentence, Jesus shows us both the cost and the call to discipleship. He gives us 3 clear marks of what a true disciple looks like. And this morning I want to look at each one of them together. The first of those marks is that being a disciple requires denial. We focus on just that first part of his statement again. We read in verse 23, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves. And that phrase can be easily misunderstood. You know, sometimes when we think about self-denial, the first thing that probably comes to mind is like, I don't know, giving up chocolate for Lent. Or denying yourself dairy, or, telling yourself that you're going to go to the gym even though you don't really feel like going to the gym. It's that kind of self-denial, like you're denying yourself something that you would like to have. But the kind of denial that Jesus is talking about goes much deeper than these small acts of self-discipline. To deny yourself in this context doesn't mean to deny yourself something. It means to deny yourself, right? To deny your id, your ego, your identity. It means to deny yourself your place on the throne of your own life. It means surrendering the idea that I am the ultimate authority over my own choices and priorities and direction. Self-denial is the decision to say, my life doesn't belong to me. My preferences are not supreme. My desires are not ultimate. Jesus is Lord, and I will follow him. And that runs directly in the face of everything our culture teaches us today. Everywhere we turn, we're told to follow our hearts, or trust in our instincts, or pursue what makes us happy. You do you. The highest good in our society is often personal comfort or personal fulfillment. Go live your truth. But Jesus teaches us that the path to true life begins with denying ourselves. Self-denial means that we stop asking, what do I want? What is my truth? And we start asking, what does Christ want? What is his truth? It means we loosen our grip on control, and we trust that his leadership, his decision-making is better than ours. It means choosing obedience even when obedience is difficult. And that leads directly into that next phrase that he uses. He says to deny yourself and take up your cross. Now, today, the cross can be seen everywhere. We're very familiar with the cross. We see it on churches. We see it outside churches. We see it on jewelry. We see it in art and decorations. But in the first century, the cross was not decorative. It was destructive. It was dreadful. The cross was an instrument of execution. It was a symbol of suffering, humiliation, and death. When someone carried a cross, it meant only one thing. That person was on their way to die. So when Jesus tells us to take up your cross, he's not talking about bearing some minor inconvenience or burden as we often picture it. He's talking about willingly laying down our lives for his sake. He's calling us to die to ourselves so that we can truly live for him. A lot of people want the encouragement of Christ without the denial of self. And they want the promises of Christ without the cost of following him. But the call of discipleship invites us to something much deeper. Jesus doesn't simply call us to admire him. He calls us to deny ourselves, to take up our cross and follow him. Self-denial means that we stop making everything about me, my wants, my dreams, my desires, my goals, and start making it about Jesus. It means we're willing to obey even when obedience stretches us or challenges us or leads us outside of our comfort zones. So denial is the first mark of genuine discipleship. The second is dedication. Dedication. Returning again to Luke chapter 9, he continues on here in this verse. He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. That little word daily is very important. Jesus doesn't call us to be a disciple. The call to be a disciple, that is not a one-time decision or an occasional spiritual activity, right? It describes a daily posture of surrender. Following Jesus isn't something that we just do once a week at church. It's not something that we do once in a while whenever it's convenient. It's an ongoing commitment that shapes the way we think, the way we speak, the way we treat others, and the way that we make decisions. Jesus is essentially saying, if you want to follow me, you have to be all in every day. Discipleship isn't this part-time job. It's not your side hustle. It is not an add-on to an already crowded life. Jesus isn't asking for a small corner or piece of our existence. He's calling us to put our entire lives in His hand, under His leadership. Every day we choose again, when we wake up, who is going to sit on the throne of our hearts. Several years ago, a news story highlighted a growing group of people who refer to themselves as flexitarians. Has anybody heard this term before? Flexitarians. So flexitarians are people who generally live as vegetarians or vegans, but sometimes make exceptions when there's something particularly good on the menu, right? One adherent in the interview, her name's Christy, age 28, put it perfectly. She said, I typically eat vegetarian, but I also really like bacon. And I can't blame her. I'm the same way. I like bacon. Who wouldn't? But that word, flexitarian, stuck in my mind because it captures something about the way we live today. We like to keep our options open. We want the benefits without the full weight of dedication to something. We want flexibility in case something more comfortable or convenient comes along. And you know what? Maybe that's okay on your diet. I'm not saying you can't have a cheat day when you commit to a certain diet, but sometimes we try to treat our faith that same way. We want the love of Jesus, but we hesitate when obedience becomes difficult. And we want the promises of Christ, but we struggle when His teachings challenge our preferences. We may be thinking to ourselves, I want to follow Jesus, but don't ask me to forgive this person who hurt me. Don't ask me to let go of this resentment that I'm holding on to. Don't ask me to trust God with my finances. Don't ask me to surrender this relationship or this habit or this area of my life. I want to compartmentalize that and keep that apart. Without realizing it, we can begin treating the teachings of Jesus like a buffet line. Choosing what appeals to us and then quietly leaving the rest behind. But Jesus doesn't invite us to selective discipleship. He calls us to wholehearted devotion. He's not looking for half-hearted followers or occasional admirers. He calls us to a life of daily dedication. The Apostle Paul understood this kind of commitment. After encountering Christ on the road to Damascus, he was radically transformed. And he described his own transformation this way in Galatians 2:20. He says, my old self has been crucified with Christ. And it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. This is the language of total surrender. Paul is saying that when he trusted Christ, his life was no longer his own. It wasn't centered on his own plans or his own ambitions or his own agenda or reputation. His identity, his purpose, and his direction are now rooted in Jesus. This is someone who understands what it means to take up your cross daily. Daily dedication means that we're repeatedly choosing trust over control. We choose obedience over convenience. We choose faithfulness over comfort. And those daily choices over time shape who we become and who we influence and affect around us. Jesus put it this way in Mark chapter 8, verse 35. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. When you cling to your own life, you're just going to lose it. But when you surrender your life to Christ, you gain not just life, but eternal life and so much more, everything that goes along with that. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is simple but deeply personal. Who am I really living for? Am I primarily living for my own comfort, my own advancement, my own desires? Or am I living for the one who loved me and gave himself for me? Jesus says that true disciples deny self and take up their cross daily. The first mark of a true disciple is denial. The second is dedication. The third is direction. Direction. Returning once more to Jesus' statement, he says again in verse 23, whoever wants to be my disciple must follow me. Now that's probably the most obvious part of the whole thing, right? But it's also the most challenging, because it is one thing to believe in Jesus. It's one thing to admire Jesus. It's a whole other thing entirely to actually follow Jesus. Let's think about that word disciple a little more deeply. Outside of a church setting, we rarely use that word. It's not a common part of our everyday vocabulary. But in the first century Jewish world, discipleship was a very familiar concept. Jesus was a Jewish rabbi, a teacher, and rabbis often had disciples who committed their lives to learning from their rabbi. And in that culture, education often began very young. Children would learn the scriptures. They were actually taught to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible, the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And the ones who were exceptionally good at that would move on and they would learn other books and have all those memorized. And the kids who really rose to the top, the cream of the crop, would often then find a rabbi to follow. And they would commit themselves to following this rabbi. And as a disciple, they would leave their home and devote themselves to not only learning what the rabbi taught, but how he lived and becoming like that rabbi. The goal wasn't simply to gain knowledge, but to imitate the teacher's way of life. And there was this traditional blessing spoken over young disciples when they left home. They would say, "May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi." Isn't that a beautiful picture? It describes a student following so closely behind his or her teacher that the dust from the rabbi's sandals would get kicked up and it would cover their robe. In other words, stay close. Pay attention. Walk the same path. Live the same way. That's the kind of relationship that Jesus invites us into. He calls us to follow him so closely that our lives begin to reflect his character, his priorities, his love for others. Discipleship isn't just about learning what Jesus taught. It's learning the way he lived and living that way ourselves. And of course, we can't physically walk behind Jesus. He can't kick dirt onto us the way that he would have with his first disciples. But that's why Peter writes in 1 Peter 2, verse 21, Christ left you an example so that you could follow in his footsteps. Through the Gospels, we see how Jesus treated people, how he responded to opposition, how he showed compassion, how he spoke truth, how he trusted in the Father, and how he remained faithful even in the midst of suffering. To follow Jesus means that we allow his life, his example, to shape our lives. We learn to love what he loved. We learn to value what he valued. We learn to respond the way he responds. Over time, our attitudes, our priorities, our actions begin to reflect him. In other words, real disciples do more than simply believe in Jesus. They pattern their lives after Jesus. They seek to become more and more like him in the way that we think, speak, and the way we live our lives. So as we've seen today, Jesus' call to discipleship is clear, but challenging. It's a call to deny ourselves, to take up our cross daily, and to follow him. That first mark of self-denial means letting go of our own autonomy and putting Christ first. The second, dedication, committing our whole lives day by day to following him. And the third, direction, means walking in the footsteps of Jesus, allowing him to lead. Where he leads, I follow. Denial, dedication, direction. That is the path of discipleship. And being a disciple isn't a casual choice or a part-time effort. It's a journey that costs us, transforms us, and ultimately leads us to a life that is far greater than anything that we could have built on our own. So over the next 3 weeks, we're going to dig deeper into what it means to truly be discipled and how following Jesus can change everything. In the meantime, Jesus' invitation to follow him still stands. His invitation in Luke 9 on that hillside, surrounded by thousands of people, is his same invitation to you and to me today. So if you sense God stirring your heart today, don't ignore that invitation. If I can pray with you or talk with you or help you take a step toward following Christ more deeply, then I'd be honored to do that. Let's stand and sing together, church.